Hello everyone, this is the Shientist, and welcome to another audio and podcast in the second series on the LabZtorm effect. This audio podcast will be will have a focus on designing your research. So the first one was in this series was about the research development framework in 2011, which most researchers at varying levels throughout their development, learning and professional development use areas around the research development development framework from 2011 to hone in on areas so that they can ensure that the rigor around aspects around their research as well as their personal professional development are focused accordingly and structured in a way so that the research throughout has a real impact and real effect. This podcast audio will be on designing designing your research, and this is again Storm Robotics production. There will be several areas, several different perspectives that this audio will align with, align to, and these include these are points really, or more like bullet points really, that every researcher, irrespective of how and what they're doing their research around, and what they're looking to hone in on, these are the elements or to think about. So first and foremost, there's the hypothesis, and the hypothesis is really about identifying those gaps that need to be explored, so that it bridges the research overall, bridges understanding between what's been understood in literature on a given subject, or even around a particular research question, and then how the researcher is going to look to identify gaps to contribute to areas of that research with more novelty and knowledge. Also, just to highlight at this point as well, early on, not all research research that's out there actually has may not all have, for example, a hypothesis. Research questions can be quite more straightforward. A hypothesis is almost to say that something is in order to identify gaps and bridge understanding. For example, there will be to the researcher's discretion to see, or through the literature, whether a hypothesis is really necessary. It may be just a straightforward a question that that a researcher wants to ask, and look to provide an answer through the research that they're going to embark on and develop. So the hypothesis is something to to ponder over, and not all research requires one. Project management, and a Gantt calendar or milestones calendar, and I will talk a little bit about project management, or task management in a bit more depth in another podcast or audio in this series later on in a future episode. But here I will just provide some main points for perspective. I would talk about highlight things around milestones and Gantt calendar, which basically you can use and set a time plan really as to the initiation or the start of a research project all the way to the end of a research project. And that could be, for example, weeks or months, and over the duration of doing a research project. And then I will talk a little bit about the literature review and what that should entail, what that should focus around. In a way, it probably sounds quite straightforward, but there's I will highlight some areas, some things that and areas that need more, perhaps need a bit more enlightening focuses around. Then I will talk about methodologies and in research that I have done in the past. For example, that's been around mixed methodologies, quantitative and qualitative research. But there's lots of other kinds of research that those in healthcare or in the health profession, for example, if they are going to embark on doing any research, they can implement various. There are various methodologies that can be implemented to substantiate and provide answers to a particular research question. I will talk a little bit about areas around costing elements for research. There will be a podcast or audio in a future episode relating to funding research, and in this particular podcast, I will just provide some of the baseline points on that. I will talk a little bit about collecting data, collecting data and analyzing data. Although those two elements really will also have a focus as part of the methodology discussion that will be put forward in here. And then finally, really more about writing up your research and presenting scientific sort of research is never an easy. It's never easy. It does take time and it does take practice. So there will be a focus on where I will provide an understanding of what, for example, scientific research writing should look like, or appear, or what makes it sort of stand out, and what can be helpful to get your work to peer review publication stage, so it's ready to be put forward to particular journal for publication, for example. So let's crack on then, and I'll start off with a bit of understanding around the hypothesis, and the hypothesis is really a kind of another way of saying another word really to for researchers to explore and identify whether there are gaps in a particular around a particular focus within an area within an area around what they inevitably are quite could be intrigued by. So before beginning, you have to think about what gap needs to be bridged or filled where research is concerned, and healthcare research is quite intricate, but it's also individuals who embark on doing any healthcare research have to be quite savvy to understand at least in the immediate area of what they're looking to kind of bring contribution to an area of healthcare. For example, they have to at least know if it, the focus, the area of the focus that they're actually looking at, but also how that might intertwine and be linked with other relatable research. So that often cause researchers to explore other more relatable areas to, for example, healthcare or health research before they actually identify where something needs to be where contribution needs to be made in scientific writing, for example. It might mean looking back at literature and saying, and then when after looking back and then coming back to more recent literature, for example, is only then really a researcher can actually say that I can formulate a particular research question or a hypothesis. So started to think about creating a hypothesis, and that might be, for example, a research question or a statement that stands out to help inform an overall research proposal, and that is perhaps that's research kind of perspective number one, really, or priority number one, when looking into areas into a focus that maybe researchers can identify quite quickly. On the one hand, that something needs to be done, but on the other hand, it might be that something has already been done about it, but it might mean that the researcher needs to look at it from a different perspective. So that's something that needs to be verified here. The research proposal should include the following sections. So as part of the initial stages around identifying gaps and maybe formulating a hypothesis, if not hypothesis, an overall kind of research question. This also means that a research proposal has to be part and parcel of the underpinnings of early research writing. So there has to be, for example, and this is how most researchers focus bring together their research proposal, for example. So there will be a background or an introduction. It may even be referred to as a if not background or an introduction, an overview. Then there's the hypothesis and then the research question, then the aims, and then the objectives. And some research questions don't have some research questions only have aims, they don't have objectives. And that's not really an issue, but sometimes it helps to have a few sub-objectives as part of a main aim. So that's an important to take note of. And then there's ethics, which relate to how a research is going to apart from conduct and perform aspects of the research, how are they going to ensure that it's ethically sound and in keeping with research guidelines and remit. So that's important as well. And then there's I mentioned a little bit, but just as, on this, but highlight that as part of the research proposal, there has to be a focus on methodology, how you're looking to collect data, or how you're going to substantiate an answer, how you're going to substantiate the body of research that you are writing, for example, and how that fits in with a particular methodology. And then there should be a Gantt calendar or a milestones chart, and that should outline the schedule of work for the duration of the research that's being conducted. And normally the milestones and Gantt calendar is something that's put in an appendix or an appendices as part of, for example, if you're writing a dissertation or a thesis project, for example, or even as part of the research proposal itself, that can actually come at towards the end of the research, towards the end of the actual piece of work, and can be made reference to in any particular section, actually, of when of the initial parts of the writing. It just helps summarize really the different activities that are being carried out in an itemized way, so that colleagues or peers or collaborators can actually see that there's things that have been done or planned to take place as part of the research trajectory. Then there's along with aspects of the methodology. All methodology will require a focus, at least where in all aspects of research. There has to be a focus around proposed recruitment, or recruitment for how, apart from implementing certain methodologies, how is the researcher going to implement a pathway to recruit? How are they going to look to link in the appropriate subjects, whether healthy or not whether healthy or a long-term condition group, as is the case, as would be the case in for example, in healthcare research or health service research. How how a researcher does that is going to be important. And also, just to highlight, I guess it's important when patients are being approached or recruited, that all of that identified being approached and recruit and formally recruited, that how is that going to happen, and the researcher needs to make sure that that is again ethically sound. And ethics applications can be quite long-winded as well. I won't go into too much detail about that, but just suffice to say that ethics approval for any piece of research would need to be had before the research can actually be conducted on a practical level. The recruitment also could be, for example, laboratory specimens. It could be patients or healthy individuals to help provide perspectives on a particular a set of questions to help inform a research inquiry, or it could be, for example, for example, if it's quantitative research, again, in some way you need to highlight how you're going to implement a survey or even a poll to actually collect numerical data, for example. So that needs to be the research proposal has to have a focus on proposed recruitment. And then there has to be a list somewhere, and this can be part of the Gantt calendar or milestones calendar, or it can be in a particular section of a research proposal, for example, about what other documents might be included to make the work more to make the work robust. So, for example, as I mentioned, most research has to go through through a stage of ethics or ethics application, and basically that research then has to be focused for all intents and purposes, because only really because there has to be a kind of has to be a traceability to that particular research question, so that a research can be on the one hand can be documented safely, and also if there are any potential hindrances or barriers, the research has an ethics application linked to it. So if need be, more senior colleagues, for example, that a researcher might be working with or even collaborating with, can backtrack. So an ethics application needs to be put in there. There also might be things like, for example, if it's for example mixed methodology type research, then you need to have a copy of a topic guide, for example, consent form, consent forms, information sheets, maybe a flyer as to how how recruitment or research will be approached if you're looking to recruit actual patients to or individuals or health professionals or whoever it might be to actually help answer a particular research question. So there's that, and there's maybe a topic guide that might be developed. And obviously, if it's quantitative data collection, then you need to have a copy of poll questions or survey, the survey that's going to be implemented. Those are the examples of some of the documentation that comes part and parcel of a research proposal. Then there's things I touched on it a little bit, but there's things around the data analysis, and data analysis in the initial stages, or if in any research proposal, can be literature focused. So it might be things like what the literature says around a particular subject, or research inquiry, but what's already been published. And then if someone's embarking on further research, then there may be retrospectively some research data or analysis that has come part and parcel of that question as well, before any new particular research data collection or analysis is to be had. Then there will be should a good research proposal or a project as part of the hypothesis and the general structure of the work needs to have a summary and a proposed contribution to body of knowledge. So what, for example, is the research that that's being conducted? How has what's the contribution that's come out of that, and how does that add new knowledge, for example, to the existing evidences and knowledge base around that subject entity. Then there should be references, and throughout the project or research proposal there has to be appropriately referenced, and normally there's two main reference systems or reference formats, and that could be the Harvard method, and the other one could be the Vancouver method, and both are unique in their own ways, but how a researcher does that is based on guidances that come out from, for example, in academia. Just a few points more on this, and then I'll move on to onto the next entity around this. Where ethics is concerned as well, the application process, it's important to understand the general process around ethics application, because they can be long-winded, and getting it right first time is not always easy. Believe me when I tell you, in my experience, I've done quite a few ethics applications, and I've reviewed a few as well, and it's very difficult to kind of get right first time, and especially most ethics applications and processes that come up that are part of, maybe, for example, academic institutions, but also part of where when it comes to doing health kind of research, that there's an appropriate pathway that researchers have to take, and documentation that has to be filled to make sure that is all appropriate and fitting to the actual remit of the research that's going to be done, and there has to be there's normally most ethics applications have a list of things that researchers have to go through to make sure that they're sort of ticking the boxes, like a checklist, to make sure that they're doing all of they've covered absolutely everything with appropriateness. It's also important to develop sort of good habits where research is concerned, and this means, for example, I mentioned the Gantt calendar or milestones calendar, and you can look up examples of that online, but there's no particular correct format as to how a Gantt calendar and milestones calendar should sort of actually look like, but there are some good examples online, and that's kind of a good starting point for most researchers starting out, and sort of again itemizing sort of tasks and things that you're going to look to do as part of the research. That's important, and sort of listing them in a way so that you can mark off that it's marked off that, for example, that something is in progress, something might be completed, something is near completion, something is going to be sort of for example, might be linked with a collaborator, and it might be that would also have a specific marking or point where a researcher might say, for example, that if not near completed or completed, there's or in progress or in process, then it will say that they can say to be, for example, followed up, or to the common terminology, for example, might be to be continued or something like that. Now, apart from that, developing a research proposal or research generally should also highlight why it fits with the expertise and objectives of that particular area or specialism. How does it fit in, with what the research question might be or hypothesis? How does that actually link to for example, the body of knowledge that already exists in a particular specialism, and even to the extent that researchers have to self-critique or self-appraise, if not the literature, then also themselves to an extent, because researchers can easily get self-involved, and it's easily mistakes can easily be made, and we all have our own sort of research biases. So it's important to make sure that to sort of interrogate and critique yourself to an extent that you know that you're doing that, that as far as research goes, people will do people are doing all they can to make sure that the biases are hopefully from something that might be in the beginning. For example, if you think of a funneling system and where bias is concerned, if you think at the top of a funnel system, where things are all broad, quite broad, and that means all relating to not just the actual research question, but even even going down to the point of where literature is being identified, or how it's being identified, etc. We all have our own biases. So at the top of a funnel type system, you can imagine that all the literature might be based on the general literature, or the sort of the growing body of literature around a subject entity. But the thing is, you then have to make sure, or researchers have to make sure, that those are being critiqued enough, kind of almost several times over. They might all be relevant papers or publications in an area where research is concerned, but they have to be of a certain following a certain appraisals and toolkits can actually help make sure that researchers reduce their own biases. So at the end of a process, and that process can take something between anything from 3 to 6 months, for example, or even 6 to 12 months, depending on the novelty of the research question or hypothesis. And so therefore it means this also means that research has to the researcher has to critically appraise the literature and even themselves. So at the end of the bottom of the funnel type system, if you like, the funneling process, sorry, that would mean that everything has been done to ensure that the literature and what's been identified and in line with the research question or the hypothesis, that's been absolutely reduced, so that basically there's it shouldn't cause a bias in that way. And then it's important to seek early on how the research question, hypothesis, aims and objectives will contribute to existing scholarship. So where healthcare research is concerned, and any other research discipline really, how all of the context that has come out into the research proposal, how that actually has a link with scholars and those who have already contributed into a specialism, for example, and how someone else's research, the research that researchers are embarking on, for example, or doing, how that looks to discipline and the focuses in a scholarly way. It's also important to have a proposed contribution to knowledge, to body of knowledge section, or contribution to knowledge, which is also fine. And then that way, that should be one of the final, the main sections at toward the end of the research. So it's almost a section where you can say, what does this research add? And then the research proposal generally plays a sort of a pinnacle role in shaping and the anticipated research, and signposting really the literature and the work, so that it can be carried over the duration of a research of the research time. So that gives a bit of the background, and now I will go on to the project management. Sorry, not the project management. I'll talk about the project management in a bit later, but I will focus a little bit more just on the literature review. All the other sections I have planned to talk about will be caught up in future in a future episode, but will be linked, will be sufficely and appropriately linked to this particular audio. So, for example, it might be designing your research episode 2 or part 2, so listeners know that is a continuation. So just quickly over the literature review. I know I mentioned a few points, but at least some initial fundamental points. These are around the literature review now. I'm just going to add a bit more, a little bit more sort of emphasis or elaborate on certain bullet points. So as where the literature review is concerned, as the research proposal proposal kind of develops, it will become obvious that all information or understanding and the context should be evidenced, so that peers and those who are within the field, or those who inevitably are part of a kind of a scholarly network, or who contributed to that specialism, for example, they must literature that a researcher identifies and links has to be or should be linked in a way so that is continuous. So if you imagine reading for example, a paper publication, and then at the end of the paper publication, for example, there's a list of references. That's an example of where, for example, a story has either the story around a particular contribution to knowledge in previously has probably started out or set out, and then future research, other scholars who've contributed to that particular focus have also done that and added to that particular story, for example. So I use the word story quite loosely, because basically you think about from one when identifying your literature is where you have one paper highlights a perspective around a research question or a hypothesis that you might be intrigued by, and then if you look at another paper or two or three, based on certain key sort of key terminologies, they can actually help to identify how that the story continues, but looking at the research question or the question from different perspectives or different angles. And so it's important that whatever the research question that researchers have and develop, that the story kind of there's a continuation, though the perspective might be different, and that difference it shouldn't be it's not a bad thing if it looks completely out of the box thinking, but if there's novelty to the research question, then perhaps quite outrightly the contribution to the knowledge and the story that is going to add into actually then becomes more it becomes more broad than actually than just looking at the topic in a specific way. And then here I want to just add and say that effort to there has to be an effort to meet the challenges in the gap in the research gap being explored, and that can be that certainly can be sort of explored and investigated through literature searching. Research should consist of literature surrounding obviously the immediate area of investigation, and the basis of the literature should or literature review should define topic and provide an appropriate context, establish reasons, for example, clear perspective for reviewing the literature. And what that really means is, for example, if there's a paper or publication, maybe book, if not paper, maybe a book, or maybe other sources of that are available on a day-to-day basis, for example, but it might be something that is that might be linked to the research question that a researcher is exploring. Basically, we need in that context is highlighting as part of your the literature review or the context of the work as to why a particular paper, publication or book has been used or referenced or cited. Why did the researcher look at that paper and not, another paper, for example, that might might be more appropriate in some way, and be aware that there's no particular right way when it comes to doing a when identifying the existing body existing contribution of knowledge related to this to a research question, but there is place where or there should be place where a researcher for example highlights that for example that the literature in, for example, and I'll just throw this out there really to say that in 2010 this is what these researchers did around this topic, and then in 2000 for example more recently in 2018 researchers looking at the same thing but or looking at the topic or exploring it in another publication say this, and then the research question should actually that a researcher is developing or looking to focus and answer. They should look to make sure or do all they can really to to say why they may the sort of yes and no, why they as to why they didn't do or why they haven't, for example, used those particular examples in 2010 or 2018, or they've used both of them, but actually, because there's similarities between things that happened in 2010 and 2018, for example, the researcher may want to highlight or state that they look to embark on identifying answers to a research question from a completely sort of a complete different angle that has not been not just highlighted in 2010, for example, in 2018, but in the time that's between 2010 and 2018, and how there may not have been that focus that the researcher is looking into as part of their research question and research development, and they want to add that not as novelty to kind of add contribution to knowledge in that way, or in that way. So then there's also important to state the scope of the review. So, for example, what is included and what isn't, so this keeps the writing focused. And again, that kind of links to what I've just said about looking at literature over a certain time point. So a good researcher, and no matter the experience, really, a good time frame for any researcher to look over literature or look at literature around a specific research question that they're exploring normally kind of aligns to something between looking at literature over a 10 or a 15-year duration, and just seeing if there's any changes that have been made or updates that have been made in that area and contribution to that field in that time frame. And if there has, it gives actually more scope to for the researcher to kind of focus their research, interrogating the literature a bit more in over that time frame, so that to kind of also say that, well, having looked over that sort of duration, there hasn't actually been any, there's been little contribution or no specific contribution around this specific question, but there has been some understanding around this research question, and I, for example, as a researcher can say, for example, I wanted to interrogate this line of inquiry in more detail as well. So it's important to kind of focus so that it keeps things diverse, and also researchers from at the outset should make sure that the writing is not just focused, not just sort of inclusive, but also quite the writing, research and the literature search should be quite diverse as well. And then just to highlight a few points on the sort of on the organization of literature, apart from Gantt charts and milestone calendars and that sort of thing, and project management things, and I'll talk about that in a future episode. The body of review should organize the literature according to should be organized, sorry, according to common themes, provide insight into the relation between a chosen topic and the broader subject area. Example, that an example could be, for example, does is A affected by B? Is B affected by A? And the researcher could say that I'm looking to explore and say, for example, we know that A is affected by B. We do know that B is also affected by A, but by intervening, for example, on A, we know that that can stop or inhibit B from, or precluding from B from taking place. But if that is to be understood, and the evidence also that is substantiated to that fact, then it may well be that there's another route or a pathway, basically, where C, which is also part of this, that should or could help help researchers align that inquiry as well, and also have a view and specific focus on the aspects of sort of the recruitment aspects. So in literature, like as I mentioned, for example, if it's on a given area of healthcare research or healthcare service research, then basically it should be that if sort of good research should be able to should be not just representable, should be repeatable as well, so that future researchers can carry out the same sort of methodologies and potentially recruit the same kinds of cohorts to conduct the research. So what is important to here is to highlight that research from what an investigator is set out to do. In the literature, there will be lots of different, depending on what the research question is, in that, for example, 10 to 15 year in 10 to 15 year duration, for example, as part of initial literature research or literature reviewing, there may be lots of different ways, or lots of different ways, or several ways at least, that highlight that that research actually has been conducted using particular methodologies, and maybe for example, one methodology, it might be better to use that particular methodology versus, for example, mixed methodology, or quantitative versus qualitative, or qualitative versus quantitative, or if you're doing any other kinds of research, then it's important to make sure that is transparent throughout as well. So the conclusion of a literature review, or part of the literature review, should also summarize important aspects, which is a common entity, really. It should be the conclusion should around literature reviewing, after conducting the literature review, should be researchers should evaluate the current state, the current state around a particular research gap, and so that it's robust, or the research question is there's an that the research question it can be answered, and of course should make sense, identify significant flaws or gaps in existing knowledge, and to identify flaws or gaps, that's part and parcel of doing a literature search anyway. It's part of the designing of the research in the initial phases of any project, and so it's very important to focus to link the literature to highlight and to highlight gaps or where there might be flaws is not a bad thing. It's actually highlighting that, for example, there may have been limitations in previous research because researchers at that time may have not had had access to particular facilities, or those a series of advancements or things like that were not made available. They just did not exist. Or there might be those baseline reasons, and so to highlight them, but obviously to be able to articulate them in a scholarly in a scholarly demeanor. That's the sort of point I want to make here, and then outline the areas for future study, and of course again make it ensuring that there's sort of rigor throughout the literature review process, and I would recommend that when focusing a research question or developing a research question, it's important to have a literature review. Should be part and parcel of the research proposal. It's kind of in a way, it's kind of a given. But what researchers should do to make research really kind of stand out is basically where researchers should look to develop, for example, a literature review, so that that work is potentially publishable work, and that can be. It can be a kind of a formal literature review. It could be like a narrative review on a subject, on the research gap that you're looking to explore, and hone in on, maybe from a different perspective, or it could be something more in depth if you're an advanced researcher, but you still sort of want to ensure that you cover different aspects of the research interrogation. For example, then you might want to, for example, attempt to do a systematic review, for example, which are quite in depth, and they do take and they can take some time. But having that exposure and experience as part of the research journey is quite an important one. Even trying to do meta-analyses and focusing around the more intricate nature of what data sets around a particular research question, and depending on what the inquiry is, what data sets amongst for example, key main authors or several authors who have contributed to the area, and what their data sets are saying, and then the meta-analysis is basically analysis of analysis, if that makes sense. And so that can be quite arduous, it can be quite long-winded, but these are all kind of things, areas where researchers can ensure that they bring in rigor and actually also reduce any potential further biases throughout their work. And having something published early on as well means that it should really add more robustness and strength to the nature of inquiry and the contribution to knowledge around that focus. Then becomes a bit more sort of versatile. I'm going to draw this podcast audio to an end, but just a few helpful, hopefully some helpful references and helpful links, and I will probably these ones will probably be highlighted in part 2 of this of the podcast or audio around designing your research. So there's a reference by publication by Bell in 2014 where they did there was a work published on doing your research project, a guide for first-time researchers, and it's a book publication, a 6th edition. It's in its 6th edition at the moment, but it's in Open University Press publication. There's another book publication, The Essential Guide to Doing Your Research Project, and that's in a 2nd edition of Sage, and that's a Los Angeles publication. There's Murray and Murray has 2 book publications, one in 2009 and the other in 2013, and both of them are very good initial reads. They both have the same title, but one is in 2nd edition, one is in a 3rd edition. So the book title is called Writing for Academic Journals, 2nd edition, and that's in an Open University Press, again an Open University Press publication. And then the same book title, but a 3rd edition, that's was published in 2013 by Murray. And then there's a publication by Locke and the team in 2014, a book publication on proposals that work, a guide for planning dissertations and grant proposals. That's in the 6th edition, and it's a Sage publication. Finally, there's a book publication on research proposals by Denscombe in 2012. It's research proposals, a practical guide, and that's a McGraw-Hill Open University Press publication as well. There are some helpful resources as well. I've mentioned in a previous podcast the Research Development 2011. Around that podcast, I highlighted there's a website called Vitae, and if you just type in Vitae, VITAE into your search engine, hopefully it will come up. But it's the edition that I looked at was before was 2018, and it may have been updated a little more since. But important to get an understanding of those four main domains as to how to develop as a pro. proactive researcher. So feel free to check that out. And then there's a publication called the Right to Learn, and that's actually a quite a good read. It gives a good understanding of how to sort of navigate areas of research, but also how if not research, but writing and areas of doing interrogating areas of inquiry where they can be quite long-winded. For example, the Royal Literary the Right to Learn, the Right to Learn 2018 website actually highlights some good has some good understanding in there. But you can also check out some channels on YouTube. There are some really helpful YouTube sort of how-to sort of guides around developing a research proposal, for example. And if you put, for example, developing a research proposal in your search engine, there will be some results that come up. There will be some understanding that comes out from that. And doing that it can be overwhelming in one way, because the more searching someone, the more sort of interrogating and exploring different focuses can become quite overwhelming quite quickly. And so this hopefully gives an initial overview of what it should be sort of first basis steps, and then after these first sort of steps are taken around research and the research journey, then the researcher becomes it can kind of develops and should be able to navigate aspects and the whole research journey and areas around designing your research can be quite if not arduous, it can be quite most of that will be a kind of a solo or a solo process. So it's important to sort of identify colleagues who might have might be going through the same particular journey, and if they're not available to you, or because everyone has different things going on, not to worry. You can also check out use that opportunity, as a way to develop more, and don't think of it as a sort of a negative impasse. I hope this has helped, and thank you for listening. This has been a Storm Lobostics production around designing your research, and on the series the LabZtorm effect. Hopefully future listeners will get a bit more understanding on other areas that I look to focus on. Thank you for listening.